Looking for trusted vehicle protection? American Guardian Warranty Services has you covered. Since 1998, we've delivered top-tier coverage, award-winning support, and industry-leading training to keep your business moving forward. Every way forward.
Welcome to Daily Drive for Tuesday, July 22nd, 2025. I'm Jake Neer in Detroit, in for Kellen Walker. Today on the show, tariffs cost GM more than $1 billion in the second quarter. Nissan plans to shut down the company's first plant outside of Japan. And Asbury completes its $1.5 billion purchase of Herb Chambers. Plus, our own Lindsay Van Hully joins the show to talk about this year's Future Product Pipeline series here at Automotive News and how General Motors looks to plan for an uncertain future.
What do we bring to market? What kind of powertrain? Where do we put it? What time do we bring it? All of those things get a lot more complicated.
Let's run through all the news you need to know to keep up in the auto industry. General Motors' second quarter net income dropped 35% to $1.9 billion. Import tariffs cost the automaker $1.1 billion since President Donald Trump began imposing them in April. The automaker says it expects a higher tariff impact in the third quarter, but on this morning's investors call, CEO Mary Barra said GM is working to offset at least 30% of the government's charges with production changes and other cost cutting.
We have delivered strong underlying operating performance, and we are positioning the business for a profitable long-term future as we adapt to new trade and tax policies and a rapidly evolving tech landscape.
GM said its global revenue declined 1.8% to $47.1 billion in the quarter that ended on June 30th. Adjusted earnings before interest and taxes fell 32% to just over $3 billion. Nissan plans to shrink its industrial footprint in Mexico by ending production at 2 assembly plants. According to 2 people with knowledge of the matter who spoke with us at Automotive News, Nissan is expected to shut down its nearly 60-year-old CVAC plant in south-central Mexico no later than March 2027. On top of that, Nissan is expected to dissolve its Compass joint venture with Mercedes after crossover production at the 2.37 million square foot factory in Aguascalientes, Mexico concludes early next year. According to Auto Forecast Solutions, Nissan will end production of 2 Infiniti crossovers at the Compass plant in late 2025. Mercedes will halt GLB crossover production in the first quarter next year. And the nation's 5th largest public auto retailer now owns another top private dealership firm. Asbury Automotive Group completed the $1.45 billion deal to buy Herb Chambers, marching into fresh territory and absorbing a luxury-laden portfolio. The mega sale marks the largest this year tracked by Automotive News. It gives Asbury New England roots in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, with 33 dealerships and 3 collision centers, plus billions more in expected annual revenue. And those are today's headlines. And now joining us to talk about today's top story about General Motors earnings is Lindsay Van Hully, who covers GM for us here at Automotive News. Lindsay, as always, welcome back to Daily Drive.
Hi, Jake.
So the results for GM sort of confirmed some of what we already expected, which is that the company thinks tariffs will cost it somewhere between $4 and $5 billion in profits this year. But it is working to adjust its production plans to limit the impact. We'll talk a little bit more about that a little later in the show when we talk about GM's future products. But was there anything surprising to you in these results?
Not particularly, and I think some of that is just from what they've signaled already about the potential impact. You know, they told us a few months ago that they were looking at $4 to $5 billion in impact this year. They said the first quarter where this has been impacted, Q2 is about a $1.1 billion impact so far. They're looking potentially at a slightly higher impact in the third quarter, as some timing of some indirect costs that they cited might land. But, it's been an impact so far. And I think that kind of signals what they've sort of told us.
Speaking of which, GM is maintaining its full year guidance that it announced in May. How is it going to meet those expectations, especially as tariff impacts are kind of expected to only get worse throughout the rest of the year?
Yeah, they've said there's no changes to the full year guidance that they talked about in May. The forecasts that they offered are down from the start of the year, and I think that reflects the impact of tariffs that have become more clear. They did talk about those guidance ranges will get a little bit tighter toward the end of the year as more of that impact becomes clear. But they're talking right now about really being able to maintain that at this point based on what they know. And so they're going to be looking at a few different things, production changes, some cost cutting, kind of maintaining pricing, trying to avoid huge swings, huge long-term changes. One of the things they said a month ago was a $4 billion investment to add some more production of internal combustion engine vehicles to the U.S. That includes adding production of the Chevy Equinox crossover in Kansas. It's built in Mexico currently, and actually moving the Chevy Blazer production out of Mexico into Tennessee. So actions like that are part of their effort to be able to offset what they're hoping is about 30%, at least 30% of that overall impact.
And one more thing that I thought was interesting from the earnings call this morning is that GM does not plan to raise vehicle prices because of tariffs. Is it just absorbing all of those costs? We've seen suppliers come out and say that they're really looking to automakers to take those costs, and it sounds like GM's not planning to pass along any of those to its consumers.
What's interesting is that in North America, which is GM's largest and most profitable region, they reported an adjusted profit margin of 6.1% in the second quarter. By comparison, that was 10.9% a year earlier. So it certainly indicates that there's been some impact on those margins. They did talk about on the call with analysts that, excluding the impact of tariffs, that margin would have been closer to 9%. So I think what that signals is that, the business itself is still in pretty good shape. There's obviously the impact to tariffs that's happening there. And so, what they've said is, they're not making big pricing changes. They're not making big production changes, specifically highlighting South Korea, where they build the Chevy Trax and the Buick Envista, which are two of their most affordable entry-level vehicles. They've talked about those vehicles continuing to flow for customers and kind of waiting for, longer-term decisions until there's more certainty about what a trade deal might look like. So, at this point, things are continuing to move into the U.S. They're continuing to sell them. And, at this point, what happens is kind of remains to be seen as more of that tariff impact continues to land in the second half.
All right. Well, coming up, Lindsay's going to stick around so that we can talk a little bit about her reporting on GM's future product, which has a lot to do sort of with these tariff conversations as well. Lindsay, thanks very much. And we will be right back here on Daily Drive.
When it comes to vehicle protection, American Guardian Warranty Services has you covered. Since 1998, AGWS has been a trusted leader in F&I solutions, offering top-tier protection plans for autos, RVs, power sports, marine, and more, all backed by A-rated insurance carriers for reliable coverage you can count on. But we don't just offer protection, we deliver results. With award-winning marketing materials, expert dealer training through AGWS University, and exceptional customer service, we are committed to helping your business grow while keeping your customers protected. Join thousands of satisfied dealers and agents who trust AGWS for comprehensive coverage and unmatched support. Visit agws.com or call 800-579-2233 today to keep your business moving forward. Every way forward.
Welcome back to Daily Drive. I'm Jake Neer, and I'm joined by Automotive News General Motors reporter Lindsay Van Hully. So each year, we at Automotive News do a comprehensive look at future product plans for every major brand in the industry. As you and John Irwin write in a story that sort of sets up this year's collection of reports, guessing what buyers will want 5 years in the future is a gamble in the calmest times, but this year is especially not calm. Tariffs, of course, the most obvious bump in the road this time around. But what else is making this cycle especially challenging?
Yeah, that's a big piece of it, that idea of federal trade policy changing. The addition of tariffs raises a lot of questions about where do you put a product and does it get built in the US and all of those sorts of things. But there's a lot of other things at play. For a few years, we've kind of seen demand for EVs soften. Not that it's not there, it's just maybe not there to the levels that automakers had expected even a few years ago, when a lot of them had major plans to build new EVs and a variety of different segments. And so we've seen a lot of pivots away from certain things or moving toward other things, and just kind of recalculating what that demand looks like and where that capacity needs to be just to meet the market. But there's also been changes to emissions policy, to the EV tax credits that have supported some of these purchases. And a lot of these things really just raise new questions and more questions about, what do we bring to market? What kind of powertrain? Where do we put it? What time do we bring it? All of those things get a lot more complicated.
And do you have a sense of kind of how product planners are trying to navigate that? Have you heard anything about, what their approach is, how it might be different in years that are less unpredictable, I guess is the way to put it?
One of the things that I heard from multiple people is this idea of just embracing flexibility. That there's a lot of changes that are happening, and as flexible as you can be to navigate through it, that gives you more options. It's more expensive. It's more complicated when you add things like hybrids and electric vehicles and update your gasoline engine portfolios. But at the same time, there's going to be customers in all of these different segments. And, it gives automakers more options in their playbook to figure out what to bring and where, and basically gives them more options in the market with consumers based on wherever they are in that electrification journey.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the company that you cover, General Motors. We got news recently that GM is abandoning plans to build EVs at its Orion plant here in Michigan, which formerly built the Chevy Bolt and the Bolt EUV. They even make battery modules there on site. Now it won't build any EVs, so actually fewer than before, turning instead to light-duty pickups. What does that say about GM's overall commitment to electrification?
GM has not backed away from their plan to be all EV in the future. That's certainly the goal. That's something that they're still working on. When you talk with executives, that's still something that they believe is going to be the future. And that's really where a lot of the investment they've made so far is headed. I think what we're seeing is, to the point earlier about, companies rethinking plans or pivoting in efforts to kind of stay flexible with where demand is. I think that's what, to a large degree, kind of what we're seeing at Orion. The plant had made the Bolt, as you said, and it was going to be converted to build actually electric pickups. A second plant that would help kind of support production at a plant that makes them now in Detroit. And just about a month ago, they said, they were going to be investing about $4 billion in 3 U.S. plants, Orion being one of them, to really support production of internal combustion engine vehicles. And at Orion in particular, it's going to be the Chevy Silverado, the GMC Sierra, the profitable, popular light-duty full-size pickups, as well as the Cadillac Escalade, full-size SUV. And so what they've said is this really allows them to meet demand. It increases output. With the Escalade in Arlington, it sort of opens up a little bit more capacity at the Arlington plant for the other SUVs that are made there. And it really, I think, helps support just where that demand is right now for some of these vehicles. And so I think it's sort of a recognition that, there's a pivot to meet what that demand is, and that there wasn't the demand necessary to have 2 plants turning out electric pickups at this point.
Now, another brand, Cadillac, which, obviously you mentioned the Escalade there. It does seem like Cadillac is steadily continuing on its quest to become an all EV brand. What are its plans? What are some of the big highlights from Cadillac?
Yeah, I think to that point of pivoting, they certainly have become a little bit more fluid. They were the first brand to say that they were going to be all EV by 2030. And I think what we're seeing now is that switch is going to happen probably later than expected. And even, Cadillac brand leaders have said recently that to have that flexibility to kind of meet where demand is going to be important. And so they're phasing out production of a couple of their gas-powered crossovers, but it looks likely that they might refresh the XT5 internal combustion crossover. And if that happens, that's certainly signals that there could be a little bit longer lifespan for that vehicle, as well as plans to redesign the Escalade and, as it moves production to that Michigan plant. And so I think what we're seeing is that there's going to be some kind of coexistence of gasoline and electric for a number of years to come. That's certainly what the brand has said. But at the same time, they've added more EVs. A year ago, they had just the Lyriq. Now they've got 2 other EV crossovers. The Escalade has electrified. It's now the Escalade IQ, and a longer version, the Escalade IQL, is coming this year as well. So there are more EVs in the market at the same time that, there could be potentially a longer runway for some of the gasoline nameplates.
All right, pivoting a little bit back to trade, which we brought up earlier in the conversation. It seems like Buick is especially exposed to tariffs among the GM brands. What are Buick's plans right now, and are tariffs directly shaping those in a substantial way as we speak?
There's a lot of things that are uncertain about Buick's plans right now, and I think trade is potentially a big reason for that. All but the Enclave, of its 4 crossover nameplates sold in the U.S., all but one are built overseas. The Envista and the Encore GX at the entry level are built in South Korea, which has a 25% auto tariff. The Envision, the compact Envision, is built in China, and the tariff there is even higher. And so, it's unclear, I think, what a lot of the plans are down the road for Buick. Those vehicles are selling well. As far as we understand, there haven't really been any major changes to bringing those vehicles in, especially, the Envista and the GX. They're still selling really well here. Dealers really like them. And so, it's unclear what's really going to happen with that brand, especially the longer out down the road. It's also the only brand that doesn't have an EV yet. A year ago, GM said that Buick's first EV would be deferred. And there have been some plans for new energy vehicles in China, where some of them are built and on sale, but there haven't been any plans kind of publicly outlined yet for any US-bound EV. And some of that is also, I think, trade related, that, there's 100% import tariffs on EVs built in China that were put in place under the Biden administration that are still effective. And so all of that, I think, complicates the plans for Buick in the future. More to come, certainly, but right now it's, to that idea of it's a lot more complicated. I think this is a brand where some of that visibility is a little bit more unclear at this point.
Might be that Buick is especially an example of what we started the conversation out with, that it's just become so difficult to figure out where things are going to be in 5 years, especially when you're dealing with a brand that has a lot to do with the Chinese market and a lot to do with import duties.
Yeah, it's one of the brands in the US that has posted, some big sales increases so far this year. The lineup has been updated over the past 2 years, whether redesigned or freshened, or in the case of Envista, a brand new nameplate in the last couple of years. They've really put a lot of investment into keeping that brand fresh, and from all indications, the customers are gravitating to them. So that the reception there seems to be good. The question just becomes what happens, further down that line. So we'll know more, I think, obviously, as that timeline gets closer.
So we've already mentioned Chevy and GMC, but talk a little bit more about those two brands and sort of what the big highlights are for the future products for both of those.
When we talk about flexibility, we've talked about that a bit with the other brands and GM overall. Chevy and GMC are two that from the beginning have said flexibility is going to be key. They have not given dates to go fully electric. They have added EVs from, a variety of price points, thinking about the compact Equinox EV, the Bolt EV is coming back, all the way up to highly contented electric pickups. And so, the idea being that there are options for customers, whatever their adoption might be. Do they still want internal combustion engines? Those have been updated. There's new vehicles, crossovers, SUVs on the market. Do they want an electric vehicle? There's increasingly a variety of crossover and even pickup options that they could consider as well. And so that brand has really, those two brands have really embraced flexibility in that way. I think what's coming for them is going to be, after a wave of updates to the crossovers and SUVs, we're likely to see redesigns to some of the popular pickups, the Silverado and the Sierra in the next couple of years.
Everyone on staff is always doing hard work here at Automotive News. I don't know if there's been a project that I have felt less envious of doing future product of in 2025. But you guys have done an incredible job. And to read more, you can go to autonews.com or the latest print edition of Automotive News to see what Lindsay and her colleagues have dug up here. Lindsay, thanks so much for joining us here on Daily Drive.
Thanks, Jake.
That's Daily Drive for today. I'm Jake Neer, in for Kellen Walker. Thanks to Automotive News journalists Urvaksh Karkaria, John Hutter, and Julie Walker for their reporting for today's podcast. You can get the latest news on product planning, earnings results, and everything happening in the auto industry at autonews.com. Come back tomorrow for a look at what drives Bill Ford, as told by his children.
It's maybe one of the biggest lessons I've learned from my dad. He always sought out other passions, other endeavors, and most importantly, to surround himself with people that were not the same people that he was interacting with on a day-to-day basis in his career.
We'd love to hear from you. Let us know what you think of the show and the topics we covered today. Send us an email at dailydrive@autonews.com or leave us a voicemail at 313-444-2774. And if you enjoy the podcast, remember to like, leave a review, and subscribe so you never miss an episode.